Hi, this is Catherine, and welcome back to Taking Tea with Catherine. I need to drink this tea called Stress Support, or is it Stress Comfort? It doesn't matter. It's about stress. And from Yogi Tea because I'm not really anxious, but I'm very excited about talking about my favorite Victorian authors. So, and also because it's a really good autumnal tasting tea. It's kind of like a cross between citrusy and autumnal spices, which is also helpful because I'm getting over a cold. I'm pretty much over it. My nose is a little bit red still. You need to see that. Otherwise, I'm good. And I'm using this lovely Alice in Wonderland mug because I'm going to mention Lewis Carroll. Spoiler alert, not love, but like. So what I mean there is, when I talk about these writers, I have two categories. One is like, and I'm going to go through them in rapid succession because I don't want to explain too much why I don't love them, because I want to get into my love fest more than anything. But I like them. I would recommend them. There's something about their books that are good, but I'm not to the point that I love them, or maybe something I've read of theirs just was so depressing or something. That Thomas Hardy. So I'm going to list those in quick order. And again, this is not in order except for the two categories. I don't have a favorite. So let's start with like, and then I'm going to go into love, and I might explain a little more why I love them, but it's not going to be intensely scholarly or anything. It's going to be more emotional probably than anything, but that's okay. I'm an emotional creature, apparently. So we'll start with someone who I kind of just like because he was an interesting historical figure. I like reading about Queen Victoria and her lifetime. So Benjamin Disraeli. I did not read this one. I read Sybil, and it was really good. So Benjamin Disraeli, try it. Wilkie Collins. I want to read The Moonstone. I haven't yet. I really like The Woman in White. Love? Not yet. Like. Poor Emily Bronte. When I say that, what are you going to do? They were all poor Brontes, but I just like her. I don't love her. I like this book. I didn't love it, but I would totally recommend, if that makes any sense. Sorry, she's a middle childish, but I can't just, you know. Thomas Hardy. I've read a lot of his books. Some of them I really did like, but Tessa the D'Urbervilles just annoyed me so much that I can't put him in love. I have to put him in like. Still very great prose, very pastoral stuff. Yeah. And speaking of my little mug there, Lewis Carroll, groundbreaking children's writer, as it were. Adults could enjoy it too. Such an influence on tea parties, so I had to put him there. But do I love his writing? Probably not. Okay, so we've gotten to love now, and I will try not to gush. I have something on my shirt. I will try not to gush too much because I don't want you guys to get bored, but I do gush about this particular person. So now, when you read plays, are you like me? Do you have a hard time reading plays? Now, I like reading Shakespeare, but I prefer to watch Shakespeare. And that is for most plays. I have difficulty just sitting there. I want to hear it. But this particular writer, from what I've read of his plays, just sitting and reading the words, even the stage director, I laugh. And more than almost any playwright I have read just to sit and read through. And his novel is one of my favorite novels, even if it's a little dark in places, but the wit. So I know, I'm talking about wit. You know who I'm talking about. But it's true. Oscar Wilde. I mean, he's just so witty. He's just so funny. His wordplay, his sort of, almost like he writes like a dandy, if that makes sense. But, well, kind of true. But, and also a lot about tea, strangely enough. But it's just the little asides and everything. I can't tell you how much I laugh when I read Oscar Wilde. And we need to laugh. You know what I mean? And it's not usually cheap shots either. Sometimes they're just hilarious. Not everyone likes his style of writing, but I love it. Here's one I've read quite a lot of her books. And so far, I haven't disliked any of her books. Even the ones that were a little bit sad. And that is George Eliot. This book, particularly, Middlemarch, took me a while. I bought this book in '94 when I first went to London, and it took me probably 15 years later before I resumed reading, maybe more. And then I was like, what took me so long? Even though there are bits that drag, they talk about industrial stuff and reform bills and whatnot. And some of the story gets a little sad and a little like, oh, why do these people do this? But it's such a good story. And this is just not her only story that I love. The Mill and the Floss was good. Adam Bede was good. Silas Marner was good. Daniel Deronda I liked a lot. I'm probably forgetting other things that she wrote. But so far, everything I've ever yeah. So far, everything I've read of George Eliot, who was actually Marianne Evans, is absolutely wonderful. So, love. Now, changing slight course here. This is probably one of my favorite writers of all time, even though I've only read one of his series, as it were, of books and not his other writings, which is a shame because he would have loved for other people to get into his other writings, but everybody remembers him for Sherlock Holmes, and you know what I'm talking about. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, you could say sometimes things were inconsistent. Dr. Watson's wound from the war tends to travel, and his marriage life seems a little weird. And I was reading A Scandal in Bohemia, and he mentions Mrs. Turner as Sherlock's, Mr. Holmes' housekeeper, and we know his housekeeper was Mrs. Hudson, so that was a little what? But love. And I have to say, most of the time I like his short stories better. I think that's where he excelled for the most part. But The Sign of the Four is my favorite of his novels, although I like Hound of the Baskervilles a lot too. But, I mean, just the stories themselves, you almost can't go wrong with them. And just, I don't know, I know he's influenced a lot of detection even in real life, and the writer himself was involved in cases and helped solve them and helped get people out of jail, which is really cool. He also believed in fairies, but that's, you know, that's okay. I mean, you know, clap if you believe in fairies. But I think it's just, even though other people have written detectives that are amazing, I love Poirot, as you know, and you know, Agatha Christie in general, and other detective stories, but he is like the quintessential. Sherlock Holmes is the one from whom, even if he wasn't the first, he was the one that everyone springs from, and yes, whew, I just love rereading him. So good, and of course the adaptations are very good too. Now, let's get to another person who I only read a couple of her books. And it doesn't matter, because I still love very much of her books, and I look forward to reading more. And that is Elizabeth Gaskell. Oh, this book, I think, was actually not completed. She died, I think. Doesn't matter. It feels complete. I read this maybe close to a decade ago. A lot of these I read, because I went through like a bit of a Victorian revival about 10 years ago. And I just absolutely love the story. You really start rooting for certain characters and loving certain ones and disliking certain ones in ways that you just get so drawn in. And I also love Cranford a lot. The adaptation I like too, but it kind of stuck in other stories from Elizabeth Gaskell, which I thought was a little bit spoilery. North and South is amazing. I haven't read it, but I've seen the adaptation. Now I want to read it. But everybody who reads it is just usually in love with it. She's just a great writer, and I think, even though I think a lot of Victorian readers who love to read a lot of Victorian reading, blah, I keep saying blah today, because, know her, but I know when I started getting into reading classics and Victorian writers, I wasn't very familiar with her at all, except for I knew that she wrote Charlotte Bronte's biography. So I think she's slightly underrated, but she's getting much more rated. And I rate her as very high. Speaking of Bronte, we're going to bring two sisters in. And I'm sorry, Emily. I'm really sorry. But Charlotte is amazing. I think I've been reading her longer than the rest of, I don't know. I don't remember who I read first, but I've read more of her stuff than anyone else, I'm pretty sure. Villette I read, well, late 90s. And I want to read it again. And yeah, Jane Eyre. I don't like Jane Eyre as much as some people do, but I like Jane Eyre quite a lot. Great story. I think I read a book of hers that was called Emma, which is weird because I haven't really seen it around lately, but I think it might have been something they found and published, who knows. But I remember liking it and thinking, I still want to know what happened to it. I've also read, why am I forgetting the book I read of hers? I'm having a really big lapse today. But I read other books of hers, and wow, it's really sad today. I like Charlotte Bronte. I love Charlotte Bronte. So end of story. Amazing. The only thing I don't like about her is that she didn't like Jane Austen. Come on. You know, jealous much? But I do love her anyway. And, sorry I can't argue why. But do you know, I actually think, now I am not even halfway through this book because I got distracted by other books. Doesn't mean I don't like it. But sometimes when it changes a narrator or a time period, I get a little put off. Doesn't mean I don't like the story. I'm going to go back to it. I know I love it. But Anne Bronte, I think, is almost better than the rest of her sisters and whoever else in her family wrote. There's just something about the way she writes that is just different. I mean, still the whole deal with governesses and stuff. I mean, I loved Agnes Grey so much when I read it. And I remember thinking to myself, why did it take so long to read Anne Bronte? Why is she so underrated? I honestly think she's better than Emily. I'm not making an argument why, because it's more of enjoyment for me. But yeah, they just, I don't know. Even though their stories tend toward a lot of death and tragedy, there's just such, I don't know how to explain it. It's like darkness but hope. And it's hard. It's you really have to understand the Bronte sisters themselves to understand how that happened. And just, wow, cool characters, cool plots. Amazing that so many people, one family. Although there's the Mitfords as well. I talk like I know what I'm talking about. But anyway, so now I'm going to talk about two, because I'm going to have to end this soon because we're just rambling. But and I'm not making much sense because I'm talking out of love and not out of logic most of the time today. But and I talk so much about Arthur Conan Doyle. I still love him. I've never read any of his Professor Challenger or other those type of stuff. My friend totally recommended it to me, my friend Kathy, but I haven't yet, but I have a feeling I'd like it. Now, no Victorian author list of mine would ever be complete without the one, the only Charles Dickens. Because, yes, there's been stories of his I wasn't crazy about, or characters I wasn't crazy about. I really don't like Oliver Twist. But when he gets it right, he gets it right. And Bleak House really, I'm not slapping you, Bleak House really gets it right. So much so, and Our Mutual Friend gets it right. Great Expectations is amazing. David Copperfield was really good. Forgetting the rest. I've seen adaptations of a few, so I haven't read all of them. I never read Little Dorrit, but from what I could tell from the adaptation, very good. Even in school, I read A Christmas Carol. I was like, this is just amazing. But Bleak House is my favorite. I did have a little bit of experience with working with wills. Not that I'm a professional. But I specifically remember a quote from someone that I worked with that was explaining why, you know, planning all the papers involved in estate planning has to be so careful and so thorough. And as an example of all things, they used Bleak House. They used the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce and how it dragged forever. And the fact that he has had such an influence on things like that, on legal life. But I think that's what makes it cool, because he worked in, I think, in a legal capacity at some point, and as I have, and not as a lawyer, but you know, and he's got insights, even though it's a totally different time period. He's got such, he reaches so many different classes of people too. He has people who are lords and ladies. He has people who are just the lowest, you know, circumstances you could imagine, and middle class people, working class people, everyone you could imagine, sweeping stairs and dancing, it doesn't matter. And he just gets into all of their heads amazingly. Sometimes he rambles, as I do. Sometimes I feel like he really was being paid by the word. But I mean, the fact that he can come up with so many different stories, so many different places, but mostly London, which doesn't hurt because I love London so much and I love reading about London, even when it's depressing London. And by the way, I started Tale of Two Cities finally, and even though I said I wasn't going to read it during October, but I read it a little bit in September, and yeah, I like it so far. So I can't, you can almost not go wrong with Charles Dickens, and if you do, there's still enough to love that, you know, again, he is, to me, if you're going to say Victorian writers, his face just pops into your head, right? Am I right? Do you know what he looked like? You probably do, because it's so familiar. And now, last but not least, by any means, I've mentioned him many times, more underrated, again, like Elizabeth Gaskell, who was an amazing writer, and a lot of people who read Victorian literature have heard of her, but your everyday person in the street, and you say Victorian writers, and they may say Dickens, they may talk about other people, but not everyone remembers to mention the very, very prolific Anthony Trollope, and he's another one who's written on so many levels and in so much different society. And so he puts himself in the story, as it were. In one example, he really almost basically does, because he puts a writer in the middle of a fox hunt that is basically like himself. But he has an understanding of people, not perfect, no one's perfect, but that kind of surpasses most of these writers. Especially, again, not perfectly, but especially females, which I like, because, you know, sometimes people, some writers would write women as a little bit, you know, precious, and that could be irritating. Not saying that women weren't sometimes, you know, there's all different kinds, but there's something about him and the way he has their inner dialogue, which isn't really that far off. So I'm like, wow, he's impressive. He wrote so many books. I cannot even sit and list all the books he wrote, and it's amazing how little of it is remembered by people. I feel like a hipster, you know, and you may not have heard of him, but a lot of you who are watching this probably have heard of him and have probably read a lot of him. So, you know, I don't need to go on and on about that. I don't think I need to sell you any of these writers. I'm talking about why I like them, really. But The Way We Live Now I'm showing mainly because I think this is my favorite of his books. I've started the Pallisers, and I kind of left off in the Barsetshire, but I want to go back. But this is the one that I read that put me, if I were to just read this book of his, and if it was his only book, I might have put him in my favorite Victorian authors. Just because of this one, I read it during the interesting times of the late aughts, and it was so timely, and the whole deal of this businessman and how he kind of just draws people in and how things go. It was so perfect, and there were some very ridiculous characters in here, but there were also some amazing ones. And he does write with a wit, not like Oscar Wilde. Like, I'm not usually laughing out loud, but the dialogue is amazing. Descriptions are amazing. He, you know, occasionally will go off a little bit into descriptions of things that are like, oh, right, I really didn't need to read all of that, but really not that badly. Because I'm going to use one of my favorite, well, at the time anyway, he was. I haven't read him in a long time. Victor Hugo, from my French writers. I read Les Miserables back in the early 90s, English version, English translation, and I still say it's an amazing, wonderful book. But man, there's whole chapters in there and sections that you say, was this necessary? Did this have to go there? And even Dickens can do that sometimes, but Trollope, so far, I don't feel that. I feel like it works. I mean, maybe it could have been taken out, but no, it's good. Anyway, so I've gone long enough talking about my favorite writers. I intended this to be more of like a listicle situation, just the ones I really like, but sometimes you have to talk a little bit. And I know I'm not as scholarly about this as I could be, and that's okay, because I'm just, you know, I really don't, even though I like to learn, I really don't read Victorian literature just to learn things. You do learn about the times, and I become curious and I read more nonfiction as a result. Totally. But I really read it because of just getting into people and because people are the most interesting things. And the Victorians really went there, you know? They really got farther than most people had done, most writers had done previous to them. Most. So, yeah, and these are some of the best examples. Even the ones who are a little fanciful just can, you know... I think I've said all I need to say. So, what do you think? Do you agree with me? I don't want arguments, but do you agree with me? Do any of these writers you think particularly not so great, and why? Or why did I not love and like Emily Bronte, for instance? If you have any comments, please, comment section down below. I love to talk about things. I like to write about things. So, this has been Catherine from Taking Tea with Catherine, going on, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Well, not this tea, because you couldn't have the tea. Sorry, but you can find these teas maybe in your shop. Okay, finishing off. Catherine from Taking Tea with Catherine. Have a lovely Victober and a lovely day. Bye!